Well, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us again for our third week of Webcasts brought to you by the Bellevue Chamber of Commerce. My name is Joe Fain. I'm the President and CEO of the Bellevue Chamber, and it's just great to have you joining us again. We've had a lot of great and very interesting conversations over the last 3 weeks on everything from the economy to teleworking technologies to keeping your workforce motivated in a decentralized world. And today we're turning our topic to something that's become very important as so many people are working from home on personal devices, away from the security of their central networks. And when a lot of folks that haven't had a lot of sophisticated training in how to keep their home network safe are being asked to work with very important data. And we've got a couple of great experts that are joining us to talk about cybersecurity today. And we look forward to taking your questions throughout this next 45 minutes, because of course these webinars really are a lot of fun to watch, but they are far more fun and a lot more impactful if you participate in them. So please look at your screens. In the bottom of there, you've got both your chat window, you've got your Q&A button. Please ask questions, upvote your fellow participants' questions so that we know which ones are really on the minds of the folks that are participating. And again, all of these webcasts that we've done over the last week, I believe this is number 6, are available at bellevuechamber.org/webcast. We'll be posting this by the end of the day, and so you can share it around, putting it on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And so it's a great opportunity to share with folks that may not have been able to participate in person here today, but we're very happy that you have taken the time to do this, and we're going to jump right into the program. And so I want to introduce one of our first panelists today, Pete Jarvis, the Vice President for Business Development at Polyverse. Pete, Polyverse is a Bellevue startup company, and Pete's been working with leading edge cyber technology, stopping attacks before they ever start. He's got a track record of creating innovative solutions and platforms that address the needs of this emerging issues of intellectual property and control of data. And it's just a tremendous opportunity that we have him with us today to tell us a little bit about how to keep us safe at home and to answer our questions. Pete, welcome. Tell me, are we safer today than we were 3 weeks ago when it comes to cybersecurity?
I think we're about the same. You know, the characteristic is that there's a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt about security. There's a couple of simple things that you can do to protect yourself as a small business. I've helped start a business with my brothers in the UK, and I think that's some of the stuff we want to talk about today, especially in light of people being at home.
Well, I appreciate again your opportunity to share some thoughts with us. We're certainly excited to have such a great expert in the field, and hopefully that this next 45 minutes will provide a lot of opportunity for folks to learn ways to keep themselves safe. Part of my fear in hosting this webinar today was that the next 45 minutes would merely scare people into just sitting on their couches and not touching their computers. But we've certainly seen a lot of increase in cyber attacks and phishing and robocalls and everything of the like. And so it's never been a more important time for our small to medium-sized business owners to have these tools at their disposal. So take it away, Pete. Thanks.
Okay, so great to talk to everyone today. So what I wanted to do really is talk about a couple of simple things. So I want to give you a framework to think about your small business and the way in which you think about cybersecurity. And then actually what I really want to do is talk about that in the context of telecommuting, and then give you 5 or 6 clear bullet points that you could take back into your business and implement. Because I think that's way easier than actually going through all of the complexities. So to start, what I really wanted to do is just talk about this. What is actually the problem? Well, the core problem that you end up with today is that there is a gap between when a cyber exploit is discovered and when it is fixed. And that essentially is the deployment area for most security attacks. So when you think about things like phishing, malware, etc., which I'll go through in a moment, one of the things that you really want to start thinking about is the fact that that period between the discovery of the cyber exploit and the actual fix, you are actually completely unprotected. And that is something that you have to take into account. So moving on from that, the result of that is you can clearly see that cyber threat escalation has grown over the last couple of years. And the main reason for that is that it's quite profitable. If you're an attacker today, what they're looking at is really getting you to do a couple of very simple things. They either want you to click on a link, run a program, or they want you to do something like watch a video. And the reason for that is that if you do that, it allows them to execute a program. And as soon as they can execute a program on your computer, you generally have a problem. So one of the things that you want to think about is, in very simple terms, is that their goal is to get you to click on a link, run a program, etc. And so once you get to that, now you know when you get an email or if you get a video from someone, you want to ask yourself, do I know that person? And also, is it actually from them? And those are some of the things that you have to start implementing with your staff. And I'll go through that in a moment. But the key thing is, now that you're moving into this digital workplace where you have people working from home, you have people interacting, not in an office, but actually from their home environment, you have to start thinking about the accessibility, the back end, and the data integration. And then what you have to start thinking about is, who are the front line in your business? Who are the people that are going to be most targeted? Who are they going to send the emails to? Because they're going to look on LinkedIn and they're going to start trying to find out who's there. And those are the people they're going to send the phishing emails to. And their whole goal is essentially to be able to persuade you to give them information that allows them then to do something. Classic example is when you file a patent, I guarantee you will get a letter from Czechoslovakia that will ask you for $1,500. And there is a website in Czechoslovakia that lists all the people who paid $1,500, and that's it. But their scam is they literally send you an invoice, the secretary or the admin read it, and they pay it. And then you go on a hall of shame in Czechoslovakia. So the key thing is this, is now you have to start thinking about this tiered model of security. So start thinking about the internal user, the employee and the customer, and then the external experience. As soon as you start doing that, now you can start thinking about the context of, okay, what are the types of attacks that they're going to deploy against me, and how can I stop that? And so where I come from is I say, look, start thinking about something, for example, the MITRE ATT&CK framework. It's really complex, but you actually can think of it as being very simple. What you want to think about is initial access. So as an example, I know it sounds really silly, but when I was young, my parents used to say, never take sweets from strangers. Well, I think it's been updated to never take a USB drive from a stranger. Or if someone comes into the front of your office and says, hey, I want to submit my CV and it's on a USB, do not insert that into a computer. It's one of the classic ways to get control of a laptop or a desktop in a business, is to actually hand over a USB to someone, and that contains the malware. So this comes back to then there's the initial access component, there's the execution, and the key bit then is privilege escalation, because they either want to do a remote access and then escalate to a privilege level where they can then get the credentials, because what they really want are your passwords, because once they have the password file, they can go anywhere in your business. So at that point, once they've got the password file, they do lateral movement and they move into other areas. So how do you stop this? The key thing is, what you want to think about is, one, create a set of accounts that you never log into. So give you an example. In the business in the UK we used to run, I set up a set of accounts that were very simple for various names, because if anyone ever logged into those accounts, I knew the network was compromised, right? And then the other thing I would do is, with all of your general workers, set them up with a standard user account. And that's super important, because if you set that up it makes it really easy for you then to be able to control what's going on. And then the other thing I would say is turn around to all of your employees, because they're probably bringing in their own devices, and say, hey, you've got to use two-factor authentication to log in. And then finally, and this sounds really silly, but it's true, don't use real facts in the secrets that they ask you on a website. Why is that? Because I can find all of those facts, and then I've got a good chance of answering all the secret questions. Where if you make up the answers and you keep them in a password manager, it saves you a lot of time and effort, but it also means that the attacker is not being able to trawl information. So the key thing then, just from this slide, is remember these points. If you look at the MITRE ATT&CK framework, I'm not expecting you to run around and use it all, but just think about the ways in which they get initial access, which is generally email, right? And the key thing they want you to do is execution, which is click on a link, run a program, or to go to a website and enter some information. Those are the things you want to educate people on. So the first threat is phishing, which is the example we were just using, which is, you will see fake messages, I guarantee. And if you're not, I'm really impressed, because I get them all the time. And I have clicked on those links, and someone in your business will do that, especially if they're doing it from a mobile phone. So what you want to be able to do is really understand and train people to say, hey, look, when someone tries to send an email to me, check the header, look at what they're asking for. There's a lot of spam at the moment, especially with people working remotely, where they'll say, hey, can I talk to you? What's your phone number? And the reason they want your phone number is because they can spoof your phone number to talk to someone else in the business. So the next point I would bring up is the other thing you want to look at is malware, Trojans, and worms that they're sending in. And then you've also got to look at botnets, which is essentially the first two. Their goal is to take control of the computers, because then they can spread an attack elsewhere. And your goal is to stop them from doing that. And the key thing you can do is by creating those simple accounts and having standard user accounts, you'll be able to see if they're logging into your systems, because if there's an account on the network that you never use, it's a very cheap way for you to detect if someone's already got into the network. So cybersecurity checklist. One of the things I was going to say is you really want to start thinking about just listing out some simple questions that you want to ask your staff. And I'll share this later, but what you want to think about is really the basic security measures with your employees, and make sure they're educated on who they're talking to, checking where an email comes from, and then start thinking about what they're trying to do, because the attacker is always trying to elevate privilege. And that's something that we deal with at Polyverse. But the key thing you want to worry about is what is the mechanism that they try to do that? And then what you want to do is educate your workforce to say, hey, look, if you're getting emails, start thinking about the people who get the most email, and then start thinking about the people who have the most authority, and make sure there's always 2 or 3 people that have to authorize a payment, or they're reviewing when you're signing documents, etc. And one thing I was going to say is there's a great set of resources on the US Chamber of Commerce. What you can do there is you can talk and download some of the information on education, like the Test Your Internet Security IQ. That I think is going to be a great and useful thing for you to share with your staff, because especially when they're working from home, they don't have the ability to lean over and go, hey, what do you think of this? They're going to be looking at it in their own context. So what you want to be able to do is just warn them and get them prepared about what they're trying to do. And then now I want to move on to the workplace. So when you think about people working from home, with a digital workstation home office environment, you really want to think about the setup of that environment, because you as an employee have an obligation. And so the thing you want to think about is legal entitlement, no obligation to work remotely, and employee duty of care. These are things actually you want to check out, because you can get into trouble. And so one of the things I would recommend is that you think about is just, okay, what is the environment that my staff are working in? Have I looked at that? Because they do have the ability to turn around and say, hey, I don't have the correct environment. And that can lead to legal issues and legal obligations for your company. Um, and then the other thing I want to talk about is implementation. Provide tools and access, some simple tools like Zoom, Dropbox, document sharing, email, etc. will really help you. And then the other thing I would do is create an environment where you can have the phone numbers of the people that work in the office who can make decisions and get them to regularly interact, right? And the key thing is interaction, because you do want to make sure that you can actually work with people, they know what they're doing, the tasks are allocated, so you see results at the end of the week. And that actually is sort of interesting, because part of the problem at the moment is everyone's dealing with their children at home, they're dealing with a lot of environmental changes, so you're going to have to make adjustments. And that's going to be super important in protecting your environment, but also thinking about the well-being of your staff and their productivity. So recommendations, social internet, you have to take into account that they're going to be working in a social environment. They're going to be on the social internet. So you have to worry about when they're using their laptop at home, what is the information that they're downloading? A classic example at the moment is there are a lot of websites and information that has been generated, which are essentially spoofing to get access to an individual's information. So I'd strongly recommend that you turn around and say, hey, here are the 3 sites that I recommend that you look at if you want to get information. And that way then is you can reduce the risk of them downloading. There's a classic example, someone developed a COVID-19 application and everyone started downloading it, but then it actually monitors all of the PC or Macintosh environment. And then one other thing I would say then is make sure you do regular updates or you have a social meeting, and the senior management need to get together and communicate with the staff very regularly. And finally, on data access and data exchange, I'd strongly recommend that you essentially, if you have the ability, set up a VPN and you can do the remote access, etc. If you don't have that, one of the things you can do is use something like Dropbox as a secure repository, and then you can pull and push information into a shared Dropbox, which is relatively cheap, but it's a simple way of gaining access to the information with passwords and 2-factor authentication. And there are other solutions like Box, etc. I'm not recommending one particular one, but my point is that way it's a very simple, poor man's way to get access to information. And then final point I always make to people that sort of I think is really important: trust is far better than absolute control. You have to understand that people are working in a remote environment. I think it would be way easier if you look at it from a leadership and style point of view, that you define goals, you put some simple procedures and processes in place where you meet twice a week, and then you can focus on the planned and completed and progressed work. And the key thing there is it allows you to maintain your culture. And, I'm a big fan of goals and outcomes. And so I tend to turn around to people and say, look, the most important thing is to set very clear goals and outcomes for your small business so that people understand what is going on. Because in general, most of us can't afford allocating $200,000 to a person to run the security. So, one of the things that I'm involved with is making that cheaper and easier to access. But I think if you follow some of the recommendations that I articulated, create a set of accounts that you never log into, but monitor if they're logged into, set your account user levels to non-administrative privileges, use 2-factor authentication, and don't use real facts on secret questions, and use a password manager. And if you do those things in general, you're in a better place than you are today. But the most important thing is understand that someone's going to click on a link, someone is going to do something wrong. So what you want to do is to start thinking about how you segment the data on your network. And one of the things I say to people is the most secure network is one that isn't plugged in. So there's some information you actually want to take off the intranet inside your business and put it somewhere where it's secure. And then finally, set up a rollback file service system so that if you are compromised and your network your data is encrypted, you can just roll back to a secure point and you can recover all the data. And if you do those things, I think you're in a great place. With that, what I was going to say is the remote work tools you want to think about. Communication, Zoom is a great experience. Documentation and organization. There are shared document repositories. There's team environments like Slack and Microsoft Teams. There's email, which works pretty well, and a phone. And I think what you want to do is think about it along those areas, and then really start thinking about who are the people who are most likely to be attacked. And those are the people you want to most focus on educating. And with that, I'm done.
Thanks so much, Pete. We've got a lot of questions that are streaming in here with folks that are asking some real practical questions. One of it from a higher level is just understanding where a lot of these attacks are coming from. We hear a lot in the news about state-sponsored cyber attacks, a lot in the last election about Russia, et cetera. How much of the concern that our businesses that are now working remotely should be about the state-sponsored stuff, and how much of it should be, we're just dealing with someone who's using the law of large numbers to try to make a quick buck?
So look, a state-sponsored attacker can take a machine it takes about 20 minutes. I mean, I could actually show you a 0-day exploit today, right? That's real, that we've seen in the field. And that takes 1 minute, 45 seconds to take a machine, right? And so the point being is that you have to understand that there's a hierarchy. The state-sponsored cyber espionage is targeting individuals and people, and it's very much for a purpose, right? The next layer down is criminals, and their purpose is very clear. It's to make money, right? So a lot of people turn around and go, oh my God, we're being targeted. In general, you're not. What's actually happening is the way in which this happens today is people actually run an IP scan on the public internet, and they look for unpatched devices, unpatched firewalls, or other VPN servers that are unpatched. Because of the point that I made at the start is that period for 102 days where there's no protection is the period that they exploit. And so what you have to look at is the cyber criminals, the next layer down to that are really the activists who have some bug to bear. And then below that, you have literally someone who's using Kali Linux. And they might just be interested and they want to use very simple tools to gain access. There's actually a great example of a person who took over a Cayman Island bank using a Kali Linux toolset, and they wrote it up and published it on the internet. The way they did it was they just searched for the passwords. Sorry, they searched for the unpatched firewall. Dell had not done the patch. There was a second patch that was supposed to be deployed that hadn't been deployed on these devices. And that's how they gained entry into the bank, and they wire transferred £200,000 out. So my point would be is that what you have to look at is two things: ingress and egress, data coming in, data coming out. So, if you have firewalls, which I have to admit, I tend to think nowadays that they're useful, you should turn them on. And if you have virus checking, it's useful, you should turn it on. But the real thing you need to understand is that most of the cyber criminals, they use phishing techniques. So they will send you emails and someone will click on them or run something. The state-sponsored work doesn't usually affect small to medium businesses. But when people talk about China, one of the things you have to think about is it's a very, very broken up environment, and there's a lot of criminal effort happening in China. And the other thing is false flag operations, because people say, oh, that attack is from China. You actually don't know where it's from, but you do know they are attacking you. Does that answer your question?
It does, and hopefully you're able to hear me, because my audio went down in the middle of your talk there. So maybe someone in China doesn't want to hear what I have to say or what you have to say. Great overview there. Appreciate that. I'm going to go ahead and move on to our next panelist here today, and got a lot more questions that are streaming in, which is just great. I want to bring on Jerry Vergeront, who is the Director of Risk and Cybersecurity at Seattle University, my alma mater. He came to SU from his own private law practice, and after a career in cybersecurity that included both hands-on work as well as IT audit responsibility, he has had really significant roles in protecting the corporate networks at places like Starbucks and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Premera Blue Cross. So Jerry, welcome. And I'm just going to kick off with a question that was prompted by my recent technical glitches, as well as by a lot of users that have sent questions in. Is Zoom a secure system after everything we've heard in the news, or is this a portal for some? Is it more than just mischief of folks that jump on and do embarrassing things, or is it a real security issue?
So it's somewhere in the middle. It's not one extreme or the other. So Zoom is a very useful tool, as Pete had mentioned earlier before. Absolutely useful. The biggest thing is make sure that you set it up correctly. If you're worried about Zoom bombing or meeting bombing, which is when people come in, they start displaying pornography or just interrupt the meetings, you have to start looking at how can they do this. So the first thing is make sure you don't send out your personal meeting link. Whenever you create a meeting that has its own link rather than giving out your personal link. That's an option. The second thing is add waiting rooms. Make sure that people can't share their screens. Go through the meeting setup and look at the options that are available. So many of the things that people are complaining about, is like, for instance, Zoom bombing. These can easily be remedied through setting it up correctly, each meeting. Some of the other factors, what the biggest one that people were worried about was the ability to drop in and start using a web camera, particularly on Macs. That absolutely was an issue. At one point, they had actually fixed that in July, though, last July. But people get nervous about it. You also want to make sure that you're updating your Zoom, making sure that it's at the most current level, because with all the pressure that Zoom has been getting, they're trying to make fixes left and right. So you'll want to make sure you're on the most recent version of Zoom. Hopefully that answers your question there. Okay, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. For some reason, it looked like my screen had frozen. I just wanted to make sure. Okay, so I'm going to jump into my presentation. It's going to be not nearly as interesting to look at as Pete's. But that's what happens when, you're at Seattle University, it feels like class sometimes. So there we go. I'm going to go over just some of the difficulties that we have, and then just some straight bullet points of takeaways that you can use for either your medium-sized business or your small business. So whenever we're looking at telecommuting, there's always going to be some difficulties. Customer service is an issue, especially if you're a medium-sized company that supplies systems to your employees. It's a question of how am I going to be able to support these? I won't be able to have hands-on support. Being able to remote control a workstation can be challenging, although even Zoom has a solution for that. And then there's this need for employee validation, meaning that are you actually talking to an employee? Or is this somebody spoofing an employee? For medium-sized companies in particular, security monitoring is going to be interesting. For instance, are your tools, can you access them remotely? Will a VPN actually work within your environment? The other thing, and this will actually answer one of the questions that we had about VPNs, will personal VPNs show systems logging in from other locations? I'm going to jump to one of the questions that somebody asked about VPNs real quick. The thing with VPNs is that a VPN can show that you're logging in from a lot of different areas. Most sites will say, hey, if I see somebody logging in from the Seattle area in minute 1, but then they're logging in 15 minutes later from, say, California, that may be because of the VPN, and it may be showing you in different locations. The website or the application may think that your account has been compromised and prevent you from working. So the contact application that was specifically asked about that question, if you go to their website, you'll notice that they purposely had set that up so that the VPN, they had purposely set up security measures to validate where people are logging in from, to ensure that compromised accounts can't log in. The contact organization is trying to work with people individually on how to remedy this if you're using a VPN. So one of the recommendations I'll make if you're running into this issue, there's really not much you can do on your end, but definitely contact the support team whenever you run into this issue. They should be able to fix things on their side. Finally, insurance. Couple of things about insurance, especially cyber insurance. Some insurance policies do not cover devices when taken home, so you'll want to review your insurance. And of course, organizations should be liable for at-home injuries, but that's a whole different topic. So let's go on to some general protections. First things first. Whole disk encryption is critical on all systems. When people are taking their systems home and working from home, there's a much higher chance that their system is going to be lost or stolen. The last thing you want is to have an unencrypted system out there when it's lost or stolen. So make sure if it's an if it's a Microsoft operating system, Windows, make sure you have BitLocker turned on. If it's Mac, Mac has got File Vault 2 that you can turn on, but make sure that you use whole disk encryption. Patching. I cannot stress this enough. Make sure that you're patched. Pete was absolutely 100% right in that there is a lag time between 100 and some days of when a system is vulnerable before a patch is created. The thing is that you want to make sure that you get that patch as soon as possible. So one of the things I always recommend is that for all of your operating systems and for any of your applications, if they have automatic patching that can be turned on, turn them on. Next thing, don't let family members use business systems. This may seem pretty obvious, but trust me, it's not as obvious as you might think. Most users blur business and home life anymore. Sometimes that includes the systems that they have. When you're doing actual work and business on a computer, whoever has access to that computer could possibly have access to your business data. So you want to make sure that, especially if you're sending systems home with employees, that you let them know that that's a work computer. Don't let other people use it. And phishing, we're seeing an uptick in phishing, specifically related to fraud around the COVID-19 virus. So you just want to be aware of that more than anything else. There we go. Okay, mid-sized organizations. When I'm talking about mid-sized organizations, I'm looking at medium-sized companies that might have their own data center, might control their own data, and might have systems that they provide to their employees. So I just want to talk about this just for a second. And by the way, some of these things are going to apply to small businesses as well, which I'll talk about in a second. So first off, MFA, which is multi-factor authentication. It's more important now than ever. As Pete pointed out, we want to be able to prevent the escalation of accounts. We want to prevent people from logging into our environment. Multi-factor authentication is one of the best defenses that we have at this point. The nice thing is not only can you turn on multi-factor authentication for yourself, but you can also talk to any companies that you may be having, say, a software as a service type setup. They might have a multi-factor authentication solution for you too. And yes, I know it's a pain that you go to log in and then you got to check your phone for a code that's been texted to you to enter that in. I get it. But trust me, that small investment of time will save you in the long run to prevent you from being taken over. VPN access to servers. If you actually have a data center or you maintain any systems, one of the things I want to ask people is, if you're allowing folks to VPN in, when you allow people to VPN in, their systems are sitting right on your network. And I always have asked a question, do those systems have access to your servers? Do you want them to have access to your servers, direct access? And if you're not using multi-factor authentication for VPN, if somebody has a username and password, you basically have given a malicious user direct access to your servers and your data. Local administrator rights. This is mainly for folks who are supplying machines to their employees. You're going to find out that you may have locked people out of their systems by not providing them local administrator rights. Totally fine under normal circumstances. But you're going to find when you send them home and they're doing a telecommute, they may need to install a print driver because their printer at home isn't one that you supplied with them. If they may need to install a VPN, those things may require local administrator rights. You have to weigh the risks about granting somebody local administrator rights, but if nothing else, if you decide that you're going to give them the local administrator rights, say the system password, track who has the rights so that when the telecommute, when the pandemic is kind of easing down and people are returning back to work, you know who has that and you can make decisions about whether or not you're going to remove those rights and change the local passwords. Identifying employees and customers. This, by the way, applies to both midsize and small. As Pete had mentioned, there's a lot of impersonation. Make sure that you have a good way to be able to positively identify employees. It's easy to spoof a phone number. You may not want to just rely on them telling you their name and looking at their phone. If you have any kind of lookup tool, if you have any data on either customers or employees, especially employees, use a second way of being able to identify people. Fraud is rampant, and to use a quote from the 80s, but you're gonna have to trust but verify. Finally, manage systems. If you're managing systems on behalf of employees, you're probably going to have been using a tool like Microsoft's SCCM or maybe Jamf or a couple different tools that you've been using to manage systems. If so, then you're probably going to have to require people to VPN and log in for a little bit, at least for an hour a few times a week. This is specifically because you may be trying to push out changes. You may be trying to update systems, but unless they're directly connected to your network, they may not be able to receive this information. So if you're managing systems, you're going to have to look at how you're going to be able to do that remotely and validate whether or not you're going to require somebody to log in with VPN. Okay. That went the wrong way. There we go. Small organizations. For small organizations, we're really looking at BYOD, which is bring your own device. And you're going to be using mostly commercial and online products. Great. There's nothing wrong with that. First things first, company email. Your email is still important to your business. You want to make sure that you protect it. Please ensure that your employees use multi-factor authentication. On every email system, it's available. If you're using Office 365, it's a breeze to make it mandatory for everybody to use multi-factor authentication. This is going to help you out immensely. One of the things that we're seeing as far as fraud in email is that right now we're seeing a small uptick in people grabbing username and passwords and then getting into somebody's email and sending email to the rest of the organization as if they were them to perpetrate fraud. We want to prevent that, use multi-factor authentication. Pete also mentioned that online file storage and sharing is a great way to be able to make sure that people can send information back and forth. This is great. However, be vigilant. It's very easy to set up an entire folder to be available to the public. You'll want to double check all of your rights that you've applied on file storage and sharing. Don't make the mistake of thinking that it's protected, putting spreadsheets with financial data or spreadsheets with social security numbers up into this area only to find out that it had been wide open and available to anybody who could browse to it. And by the way, security through obscurity is not a good way to do security. And what I mean by that is I did some consulting with somebody once and they said, well, yeah, we have it open to everybody, but the link to get to it has so many numbers and letters that it's impossible for somebody to be able to guess what our link is. That may be hard to guess it, but there are applications out there which will just start running through all the different combinations of numbers and letters to see which file sharing links allow access to the public. Finally, don't share passwords with others. This seems like a no-brainer. It seems easy to do, and it seems basic, and it is. Problem is that when you're in a new world where everybody's working from home, somebody's going to have not thought of something. Somebody's going to be out for a little while. Somebody's going to need to do something. And it would be like, well, I don't know how to grant you that access here. Just log in with my account. And then you give your username and password. Don't do that. The problem is that even if you're absolutely 100% positive that you're giving it to somebody that you know, their system could be compromised. And as a matter of fact, one of the things I'm missing on here, and I apologize, there's another bullet point, but the reason also this is important is that the local system, especially if it's BYOD, you don't know if their system is compromised or not. So if you give out your username and password and their system is compromised, you've just given your username and password to a malicious user. So the final thing that's not a bullet point, and I apologize, it's not a bullet point, is not only make sure that you're patched and up to date, make sure that you're on the latest version of tools that you can support, but also make sure you've got antivirus, that your antivirus is running, and that the signatures, that the antivirus signatures are up to date. It's an extra layer of protection that provides peace of mind, and I highly recommend that everybody have that running. So I went through that very quickly, specifically to be able to answer questions. So at this point, I'm more than happy to start answering questions.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Those are great tips for everyone to make use of. Got a little bit of feedback in my ear, but I'll work through it. A lot of talk about VPN, a lot of talk about ways of accessing your network remotely. Is there a preference? Do we like a VPN? Would we prefer a remote terminal access or some tool that just provides kind of desktop access to a computer system? Do you have any particular technologies that you think work better than others? Jerry, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's going to depend upon the organization itself. If you're a small organization and you don't have a data center and you don't have any reason to have any, and you're not centrally managing systems, you don't necessarily need to have a VPN logging into your environment. Now, do I recommend a VPN? I always recommend a VPN. I run one even when I'm just doing normal browsing, you know, checking sports or politics or what have you. It's just good practice, but you will run into problems with some sites. So, you know, do I recommend any particular VPN? No, there's not one that I recommend over another. It's whatever's going to work with your organization.
Pete, there's a question that popping up here and there that's not necessarily about protecting your home network itself, but more about the direction of the cybersecurity industry. What kind of demand are we looking at over the next 10 years for professionals in the cybersecurity realm? Is this a quickly growing field? Should everybody be running out there to get their certs? Is it a 2-year program, a 4-year program? What'd you say?
So there's a couple of things you can do on that. So look, certification is really useful. What it does, it defines a baseline. Going to do a university course or to get accreditation, I think is beneficial. It will help with your ability to get a job, because what it does is it defines a minimum standard. No, I said minimum standard. What you really want to do, though, is you want to basically be in a position where you start building out your knowledge against a set of goals. So, for example, you can actually say, okay, this is the certification that I want to achieve. In that way, you have a clear set of goals and you can put a schedule to it. But the thing I would say to you is that the Cisco certification, some of the security standards are really useful. In general, what I look for, being truthful about it, is the ability to learn. And that's more important to me than anything. So I'll give you an example. We have a couple of people that we've hired. One of the people that I work with doesn't have a security background, but he really understands security. So, but what I would say is this, is that, first of all, be careful, because there are tons of different ways in which people will extract money from you in order to offer you a security certification that will be completely useless. So that's the first warning. The second one I would say to you is, if you go to something like the Linux Academy, there's a couple of really good training sites that you can go to, and they actually have the full certified security assessment process. And then they'll actually recommend that you go do the exams. And then from there, you can become fully certified as a security engineer, as an example. That is the process that I would recommend and follow. Plural Insight, I think, is if I was plugging people, I'd say Linux Academy, Plural Insight. All of the Cisco training is phenomenally excellent, for the simple reason that they used to have a 70% fail rate. So if someone passed, you knew they were good. Jerry, do you have any comments?
No, I think you took a lot of the thoughts that I was thinking. The only thing I was going to mention is that when talking about certificate training, whatnot, there's two things. One, if you're hiring for that type of person, or B, if you want to become that type of person. So if you want to become that type of person, the training and everything is exactly as Pete mentioned. Follow those. I always go back to the CISSP as well, just because it's such an industry standard and provides, as Pete mentioned, a complete baseline. Doesn't mean they're great, but at least it has a baseline. If you're hiring, that's a whole different topic. I agree with Pete 100%. What I look for when I'm hiring somebody is, I want to know, do they love security? Because if they love security, if it's a passion, if it's a desire, I guarantee you, I can teach people how to do things. I can teach people facts. I cannot teach somebody to love security or to be able to think in a very agile way to as I put it, be a thought criminal, to look at a system and say, how would I do this? How would I break in? And start really thinking that way. I can't teach that.
So I have a great example of this, is that there's a whole bunch of research that shows that security personnel are much more likely to click on a phishing link than a normal person. And the reason for that is they go, I'm really secure. And therefore, they're much more likely to feel that they can actually click on a link. And a real example, someone turned around to me a couple of years ago and they said, Pete, you could never hack me. And I said, really? And they went, yeah, I'm a world expert. You'll never be able to hack me. So I ended up creating a bunch of emails that I sent to them from a company, right? And so they kept deleting the emails and they got really annoyed. and they clicked the unsubscribe link, which had the payload. And so I rang up and said, I own your computer. And he said, that's impossible. I said, take a look. And he goes, I think you deserve a fine meal. How did you do that? And I said, you clicked on the unsubscribe link. Because this comes down to the old joke, you know, is I really do say this to people, is the point you really have to understand is that because of this point where you are literally unprotected for about 102 days, that's the period of exploitation. So what you want to understand is during that period, you just want to think about being careful on who are they? Do you know them? Don't click on the link. Don't open the document if you don't recognize the person, because that is the simplest way for someone like me to be able to take control of your computer. Because what do I really want to do? I just want you to run a program. And if you run a program, I'm a happy camper. And so try not to do that.
I like the term thought criminal. I'm sure we're going to use that a few times over the next few minutes. Got time for just one or two questions left. And one of them is about not necessarily the work systems that are in your home that might create vulnerability, but the explosion in IoT and the doorbells and the security systems and the locks and the lights and everything. Does a smart home create a unique vulnerability for a company that may have employees in that environment right now during this surge of home telecommuting?
So Jerry, do you want me to go first, or do you want to go first?
Go ahead, that's fine.
Okay, so I'll give you an opinion. Generally, one of the biggest problems you have with IoT devices is a lot of them end up being old and not patched. So if you look around your home, all right, one of the problems is you have these devices that you bought a couple of years ago. For example, a great example is a baby monitor, right? And you connect it to the network. And the point being is that, so I used to run UPnP, Universal Plug and Play, for Microsoft. And so one of the things that's really interesting is that UPnP stops someone with NAT, stops someone coming into a network, but it doesn't stop someone leaving a network, right? So the interesting thing here is that if someone can get a port open on the outside and get in, then they can scan your local network and find these old devices that aren't patched. Once they've found them, now they've got a friend on the network, and then they can scan for all these other devices. So the thing is what you tend to find is someone enters a network and they stay around for generally about 200 days. And they may not do anything. They may just sit there and look, right? So what you have to do is generally, if you look at some of the newer network routers, one of the things I'd recommend is create 2 Wi-Fi networks. And this is very simple because remember, if you're in a large corporate network, they can do things like encryption, they can put encryption on the wire, they can do all of these things. If you're running a small business, I personally can tell you, I'm not going to be able to do that because I don't have time. I'm trying to get the checks done and received every month. So what I would do is say, look, in the business environment, just create 2 networks. So you have one for your IoT devices and one for your laptops, if it's on a Wi-Fi network. And then in the home environment, I tend to recommend to people, I say, look, if you have old equipment, turn it off. It's that simple, yeah? If you're not using it, don't have it on. And then the same is true with your laptop. I actually had a friend of mine who rang me up and he goes, my laptop's really causing problems. You know, I've got all these problems with it. It's not working. And I said, what did you do with it? And he goes, well, my daughter used it and she installed some software. And I went, okay, can you download this software called Malwarebytes? And he goes, what's that? I said, trust me, just download it and run it for me. And he ran it for me and it pops up like 30 issues. And I said, right, all of this stuff is going to be removed. When you come back, we'll fix the laptop. But for now, we'll delete all of these things. And then I said, go into the directory and just show me a photograph of what you've got in your application directory. And he did that. And I said, delete all of these things. And he said, why? I said, because you don't use them. And if you leave them there and you're not using them, you know, it's a classic example. If you actually, a great guy to talk to or to subscribe to is a guy called Krebs on Security, Krebs. So Krebs is great because he was hacked, and he has all of the examples of what happened to him. So I highly recommend you go look at that. But simple terms, 2 networks. If the device is not being used, turn it off. Jerry, over to you, sir.
Thank you. Ditto. Everything Pete said, I agree with 100%. One of the things that we also want to look at is, even if you have the 2 networks, which I agree completely, and it is easy to do. You can even do that with your Comcast devices if you're at home. They're making it very easy to set up multiple types of networks. But one of the things that you'll be looking at for the Internet of Things is not necessarily security, but also privacy. You know, that's where a lot of concern comes in. So really, it's a question of how is it being used? What's it being pointed at? So for instance, I actually had to inform somebody who had a webcam that was sitting over their shoulder because they were working from home. They were working from home in the area where they normally have their grandchildren over. So they've got a nanny cam, and that nanny cam was pointed directly at their screen. And I had to I looked at that and I said, is your nanny cam on? And they're like, well, yeah. And I was like, okay, you may want to remove that. So, you know, there are little things about privacy that you want to look at, especially about placement.
Well, I in no way feel safer after having talked with both of you for the last hour, but I do feel very grateful. There's a lot of really great practical tips, a lot of good suggestions for software and technologies to use, and we're grateful that a couple thought criminals like you were willing to spend some time with us here today and share some of your expertise. As we're winding down here to the last minute of today's webcast, I want to remind folks to tune in on Thursday, Thursday the 9th. We've got a webinar all about human resources, working from home, layoffs, benefits, those issues that many of us are struggling with in light of current circumstances. And so we've got some legal experts, some benefit experts, some HR experts on to help work through some of the more common issues that companies are facing and provide some great guidance on how to address some of these really important and timely HR issues. As always, I hope that you'll visit us online at bellevuechamber.org/webcast to be able to see all of our previous broadcasts and to register for future ones. And then please also tell us that you're open. Visit our coronavirus resources page, click the link "We're open," and let us know that you're in operation, that you're out there serving the public, because we want to use our social media channels to be able to promote the work that you're doing and keep our local businesses alive. Again, a huge thanks to Pete and to Jerry for spending time with us today and scaring the pants off of us. Thanks to everyone else for joining us. We look forward to seeing you next time.
We were trying to calm you down.
Yeah. It's all, it's all about just being thoughtful. That's all.
Yeah.
Thanks again.
Take care.
Hey, thanks, Kev.
Thank you both.
Hey, Jerry, great